عندي 106 سنين 106 سنين الحمد لله.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Meet Us on the Abraham Path. It's really fun to see everybody. It's an unusual offering for us. So glad you've joined us today for this short course in negotiation. You may not know it, but API has a proud heritage in the world of negotiation. Our founder, William Ury, is globally renowned as a mediator and as co-author of Getting to Yes, The Power of a Positive No, Getting to Yes with Yourself, and my favorite, really, The Third Side, in which he describes his life as an anthropologist and how he comes to certain approaches to negotiation. One of our founding board members, Dr. James Sebenius at the Harvard Business School, is author of Kissinger, the Negotiator, among other books, and he, with another board member, David Lax, are co-creators of 3D negotiation. API board members are part of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard and the Program on Negotiation. So it's no wonder that they've set their sights on the Middle East for the bold ambitions of the Abraham Path Initiative. We are a nonprofit entity based in the United States that exists to support, promote, and inspire the creation of the Abraham Path. The path that we envision is a cultural walking trail approximating the legendary journey of the legendary prophet Abraham and his equally legendary family. Stories say they walked from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, a walk that's important for its actual legacy, cultures of hospitality and kindness to strangers, and they are exuberantly alive in the region we call the Middle East. The path is 2,000 miles long and growing. More than 80,000 people have walked on parts of this path in Sinai, in Palestine, in Jordan, in Turkey, and now in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where we are currently developing new trail. Importantly, the path is owned and nurtured by the people that live along it. The people that are your guides in their hometowns. The people that invite you in for a great home-cooked meal and to spend the night with their families. What we're creating at API are trails and an ethos with which people, you, may figure out your own paths to mutual understanding. Our long-term vision is that this fraught region we know as the Middle East may one day be better known as a region of splendid walking trails and hospitable people, a region known as Southwest Asia, a welcoming geography on the planet Earth. Today's guest on Meet Us on the Abraham Path has spent lots of time cultivating relationships along the emerging Abraham Path. He is a founding member of the Abraham Path Initiative and is currently the chair of our board of directors. He is co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative and author of the hot new book of real-world negotiations, successful strategies for business, government, and daily life. And he, Josh Weiss, is the person that brought me into this organization back in 2007. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Josh Weiss.
Thank you very much, Anisa. I really appreciate the lovely introduction. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining from wherever you are. I see folks are spread across the globe, which hopefully, is also a testament to this project and connecting people in that way. We thought we'd begin a little bit with talking about the chapter that Anisa had sent along, and hopefully you had a chance to read that. It was from a book that was published a few years back, where I try to lay out some of the lessons from that chapter. I'm happy to share a few of those from my own view and then see what kind of questions come to the forefront. And then we wanted to do something a little different, which is to kind of put you in breakout groups to talk about your own negotiation experience. I think a lot of times people tend to view negotiation sort of in formal terms if they're in sales or procurement or something along those lines. And yet really we negotiate all day, every day in our working world, but also, with our families, and our kids seem to be quite good at it naturally, as well as the world around us. And so we thought it'd be a nice way to have you connect with a smaller group of people and then come back and share some of those thoughts about what negotiation has been like for you, and what you've learned over the years in doing that. And so we'll do a little debrief from there. And then we're going to try to finish up a little bit by talking about this upcoming course that I'm going to be leading with a few other colleagues. And I'll give you a bit of an overview and a sense of what we're going to talk about in there, and how you can join if you're so disposed.
In your article, Josh, you referred to both horizontal and vertical axes for negotiation. On the vertical, and you had a chart that went along with it, you talk about government at the sort of the first level, and civil society and local communities. I'm curious to know, which have you found to be the diciest or most difficult groups to work with in the in the negotiation space?
It's an interesting question. I mean, honestly, I think each realm posed a different challenge, but I think probably the government level was the most difficult, because there were, certainly questions about the overall project, as well as the political dimensions of thinking about getting involved and what that might look like, et cetera. So there were a number of factors, and there were also, in many of the places along the path, and that for those of you who haven't seen it in great detail, the path, we're currently doing some things, and as Anisa mentioned, in northern Iraq, but really had worked from the beginning in Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and then, and then into Egypt. And so each one of those governments had very different interests and needs. That was sort of part of the conversation. And our challenge was to figure out, how could we persuade them to be involved in a regional project where that doesn't happen a lot? And especially when they don't always have diplomatic relations with each other, and things along those lines. So I think the governmental level certainly posed some challenges, but I think if I drill down and also go down to the very local level, well, I found people to be very hospitable, very open and welcoming. There was certainly some challenges when you got into cultures within, and this is something we're going to talk much more about in the course. When you started to work within the different countries, there were many different unique cultures. I mean, if you just take Turkey, we were working in a place called Şanlıurfa in that region, and it's very different than Istanbul or Ankara. When we started working, people said, oh, Turkey, a very Western oriented place, you won't have any problems working there. And then, when we started talking about where the path would actually be and the story of Abraham, that was in a very different place where, it was largely Kurd and Arab in orientation. There were honor cultures involved. And so there was a lot of learning that happened. And I think there was some learning that could happen through planning and preparation. But I think there was a lot also that required sort of an iterative, adaptive approach to negotiation, where we would take some steps and we would listen and we would see what kind of feedback we were getting. And that certainly led to some mistakes on our end and some challenges. And but I think it's interesting, because it's testament to this project and this endeavor that that this path has endured all those mistakes and those challenges that arose. And but what I did find along the way was that people were very interested and very keen on being part of something big. For a lot of the local folks, they didn't see their role. When we would start talking about how this path would, stretch from Haran in southeastern Turkey to Hebron in Palestine, Israel, people saw themselves as part of a much bigger endeavor, and it was really inspiring to them. The question was, how did we fit the pieces together in many ways? That was one of the real challenges. I see there are a few questions popping up in the chat box. Do you want to?
Chat box, I'm wondering if anyone wants to ask a question in person, though, too. That would be so exciting. Yes, Laura, please.
Hello, thank you for having this session, and thank you so much for being here. And this article is fascinating. I appreciate Dr. Weiss, what you're doing. And so my question was about, women are stakeholders as well, and I'm sure in the process. How did you engage the voices of women at the local level in the project as well, even though they may not have been as the primary spokespeople that you're communicating with in official capacity? How might you have been able to engage that segment of this important stakeholder group?
Yeah, Laura, that's such a good question, because it was very apparent as this project unfolded that the women were the backbone of what was going to happen here. When we started down this road, you're right that a lot of the conversations were with men, but I do remember a very pivotal moment where actually all of that changed. There was a young Palestinian woman who worked with us. For us, we brought the notion of negotiation to this, and how do you try to find your way, right? But there was a lot that we didn't know. And so the reality was that partners were critical. They were going to be the ones that were going to hold this over the long term. And so a lot of our work was finding partners. And I remember early on, we started talking about the role of women, and we got some pushback from our partners. And then, as I said, there was this young Palestinian woman who said, there's no way that this project is going to happen if you don't include women and don't have them at the center. And she was the first one that really pushed that notion. And as she pushed it, we began to see other folks sort of pulling back from that notion and saying, well, maybe that's right. Maybe there's a way in which, women really do need to be at the heart of this. And so we started down that road of speaking more and more to women, because homestays became a critical part of this project. For those of you who don't know, we've got a homestay network of upwards of 150 families that are part of that endeavor, part of this project. And so there's no way to have people stay in homes without, women playing a central role there. And what we really found actually is, once that sort of taboo, if you will, was broken, the floodgates opened, and women began to play actually a central role in everything. And without women, this project really wouldn't exist, and it wouldn't have thrived in the way that it has. Because not only are they the ones that manage the home, but they were also really effective at managing people and their experience and the hospitality and everything that came along with it. So it took a little bit of pushing. Sometimes we talk about the cultural norms, right, and what's appropriate and what's not. And in some instances, there are places where that was very welcome, and it was very appropriate for it to happen from within. I think if it had happened from outside, it probably would have been more of a challenge, and I don't think we would have gotten somewhere. So that young woman had a tremendous amount of courage, and for her, it was this next generation saying, hey, some of these norms that we've grown up with, we're not so comfortable with, and frankly, we don't want to keep going down that road.
Thanks for that, Josh. I think that's probably true planet-wide in probably every culture and every home, but it's really important to acknowledge it in that particular part of the world, because we have this impression of oppressed and suppressed women. We have a question here from Faye Simcock, which is an interesting one here. She says, how did we keep records? How did you keep records of all the things going on to make sure we stayed aligned?
Faye, I'm wondering, I don't know if you'd be comfortable just, when you say staying aligned, did you mean in a larger context of the project?
Okay, it was kind of from 2 points of view. One is that it's going over quite a long period of time. Mm-hmm. So you need to make sure you have a really strong vision, and you have to stay faithful to that vision. But also you've got different people involved, different partners. And I just thought it's a massive complexity, and you can't have one going in a very different direction.
One of the things that we learned early on was that there needed to be an ethos for the path. There needed to be almost sort of a DNA about what this was and what we were really aiming for. But what we also learned was that this was going to take a very different shape from place to place due to the people and the culture and the different ways of doing things. So, the way in which the path took shape in Turkey was really different in Palestine and very different in Jordan. So for us, I think the big thing was to have this bigger vision and have everybody be clear about what that vision was and what they were getting involved with, but then also to give them the freedom and the space to develop the path and the route in a way that made sense to them. You know, I think we at times came up against this notion of the why. You know, why was this path happening? And one of the things that we noticed as we went was there was certainly, you know, some big whys that I think people could agree to, but there are also a lot of little whys that people had different reasons for wanting to be involved in the path. And part of the question was, is that okay? You know, was that, did those contradict each other in any way? You know, some people wanted to be involved, for example, for the economic elements, others for the social benefit. You know, some people lived in fairly remote areas and they didn't have an opportunity. They were impoverished and they didn't have an opportunity to meet people. So people coming from Germany and Italy, like Oliver from Germany and places in the UK, like Louise and others that are on the call, you know, for a lot of people, getting a chance to meet folks from around the world was part of why they wanted to be involved in this. They wanted to see, what are these people like that I don't have a chance to go there. So if they're coming here, what does that mean? We had a lot of conversations about this question of why. And I think for the most part, we embraced the notion that there were going to be a lot of people involved who did this for their own reasons. I'll never forget a conversation with a Palestinian father. And I said, why did you get involved in this? Like, what was the impetus for you? And he said, well, honestly, to start, it was economic. You know, we're having a hard time making a living. And so it really helped there. But he said, you know, about, I don't know, a few months before we were talking, he said they had just hosted a group of, I think, Italian walkers. And when they left, his son turned to him, who was, I think, 5 maybe. And he said, you know, Dad, these people don't really seem that different than us. And it was that sort of social piece that also started to emerge, so that there were, when people got involved, there were things that happened that people didn't expect. And frankly, you know, to me, the fascinating part of this project has really been the unexpecteds. It's the things that emerged that we were listening for and took hold. I mean, honestly, we had not originally conceived of the notion of doing homestays. We didn't really know whether that would be even practical or possible. And yet it became a hallmark of the project. And so I think that was an important part also, Faye, to your question, which is that we also tried to really take a pretty open and adaptive approach to things. I remember one board member early on said, you know, we need to be sort of, you know, there are going to be a lot of boulders that emerge in front of us, and we need to sort of be like water, where we, you know, sort of flow around those things to try to keep it going. And so there was that. And I think also, very importantly, another board member said to us, you know, one of the real keys to working in that region is showing up and continuing to show up. You know, a lot of people go and projects start and then people disappear, and the projects that have staying power are the ones that, you know, that make a difference.
I'm going to ask you one more question here from Nizar Farsakh, and then I think we should go into our exercise.
Sure.
The question is interesting. He says he's a fan of what we do. Thank you so much, Nizar. What have we found to be effective entry point for rich conversations? Because really, conversation and relationship building is at the heart, and women, at the heart of what we do. For example, he says, when we coach leadership, we engage in narratives of change, power, inequality, difference, and loss. And on this conflict in particular, starting with narratives of loss makes engaging the other 3 narratives much more productive. What is API's secret sauce?
It's a great question. Thank you, Nizar. You know, in stepping back and looking at this, and honestly, this also comes a little bit out of the book that I wrote that Anisa mentioned. I really think it's stories. Stories are an amazing way into people's perspectives on things. They're amazing ways into a conversation. Stories often, there's a great quote where a psychologist named, her last name is Boris, said, the wonderful thing about stories is they enable people to enter where they are. You're not forcing them into a conversation to start in a different place, but you, by sharing a story that you're pretty sure they're going to grasp and understand. In every culture, stories are universal. They obviously differ, but the notion of storytelling and the importance of stories is critical. And so, the more that I think about it, when we step back and think about how did this evolve and what did we do, one of the things that happened early on was that a lot of people were like, we're not really sure we understand what you're talking about. There really wasn't a culture of walking in the Middle East other than Israel. And so what we decided to do was do what I would call a proof of concept, which honestly, we built these model segments. We worked with a couple of villages, maybe 3 or 4 villages, to set up homestays, to do meals, and have people walk and stay in those segments. And all of a sudden, that created a story. It created a vision of what this could be for people on the ground. So I really think the secret sauce was not trying to talk theoretically about things, but to show people what we really had in mind, but then also to use those stories. If you go to YouTube and Google, you'll put into YouTube the Abraham Path and films, you're going to find a lot of short little films of 2 to 3 minutes focused on different segments of the path. And our goal was to try to show people these and say, maybe this region isn't what you think it is, and maybe there's a different way to see it and view it, etc. So I really would say it has to do a lot with storytelling, and that fits very well with Abraham and his family and that story that is perhaps the most commonly shared story on the planet.
But we're going to set you up with a prompt. What's the assignment?
Sure. So we've got 3 questions for you to ponder and discuss with your breakout group mates. The first one is, think of a memorable negotiation. What do you wish you knew then that you know now? The second one is, what do you think of as your greatest negotiation failure and why? And what did you learn from it? And then finally, where was the most interesting place that you've held a negotiation? In the course, one of the things we're going to do is talk about the power of place and how do you negotiate in places that perhaps are different.
I know you'll enjoy meeting whoever ends up in your room. Here we go. All right, I think we've probably got everybody back now. And they're still smiling. That's a good thing.
We only just finished introducing ourselves to each other.
Well, now that you know each other, room 1 was Kate, Laura, and Robert.
We also had Anne. We had a very nice group, and everybody had lots of negotiations experience, but no one could think of that one most memorable. Well, and no one, really wanted to talk about the failures so much. We had one of Kate, who told us about a personal, difficult personal relationship that she was at her wit's end with some very disturbing information, and she said that the book Getting to Yes fell off the shelf in her head, and she was able to take a very emotional situation and step back from it and look at it from the balcony, and it made the world of difference in how she was able to deal with this difficult situation. And the other point was that Robert noted he negotiates every single day with all of his customers, and price, on timing, on every little bit, and he succeeds a good deal of the time. That's part of his daily life.
You go, Robert. How about hearing from Avery and Sabrine?
We didn't look at anything in particular, memorable negotiation of a specific nature, but we talked about what we might wish we know now or knew then, was the understanding the power of listening deeply in any form of negotiation or any form of communication. So, the second question on failure was also more of an understanding perspective of understanding the difference of falling into rigidity versus understanding the power of flexibility and navigating a negotiation or conversation. As far as location, we we were both kind of mobile. Sabrine mentioned a car or in some form of mode of transport, traveling while negotiating versus being in one spot or in an office or on a Zoom call or whatever. And I brought up the value of walking together and getting out in nature. I found that to be a much more meaningful space for conversation.
You mentioned, Avery, just very quickly, you mentioned, this sort of the planning piece and things along those lines, but one of our colleagues at Harvard, again, and Mike Wheeler, wrote a book called The Art of Negotiation. And in it, he talks about the importance of improv and learning the skills of improv in order to be an effective negotiator. But one of the things that he also talks about is the 80-20 rule. So you can prepare for about 80% of a negotiation, but there's going to be 20% that is unknown, unforeseen at the beginning, and that you're going to have to adapt to and learn to think sort of quickly on your feet. How do I manage that? And I think it's a very helpful sort of breakdown of the way that you should try to approach negotiations, because you certainly can do planning. I don't particularly recommend people go into negotiation with a specific plan, because it rarely unfolds that way. More sort of contingency planning, having a couple of different ways to go. But I do think that the more you can work on having an adaptive mindset, and as you said, listening and really sort of taking in what's coming at you, the better off your negotiations are going to be. Because I think that reflects real life too, and the way negotiations work. So great, thank you.
We have Nizar, Philip, and Victor.
We talked about location. We were thinking about this issue of location, and we ended up having discussion about international flights and the different cancellation or delayed experiences with Swiss Air or Croatian Air, or the different values that people place on things. And so the cultural, and we had a big question about whether things were really cultural differences or about the financial capabilities of the organization. So that was part of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next group would be Benina, Louise, and Marinella.
We talked about memorable negotiations, and Benina talked about being involved with the Berlin Wall issues, and she talked about the opportunities that were missed. Memorable negotiations where, what we did not know then that might have stopped things like Hiroshima, for instance. My big learning about negotiation was that you had to recognize when somebody didn't want to negotiate, and you actually had to spend all the work getting them to negotiate in the first place, because, people sometimes have very fixed points of view, and that can be a real learning. Whereas I'd always assumed everybody wanted win-win situations, and I had to learn they didn't.
It's a hard one to learn, isn't it, Louise?
I think in the business world context, most people, the forum for negotiating seems to be pretty straightforward. I think one of the harder parts of an effort like the Abraham Path was actually getting people to the table, as you say, and be there, and in what way, right? What meets their interests? What are their interests? And are they best served by being part of something like this, or perhaps something else, right? So I think that's insightful, and timing matters, and somebody who might say, I don't think I want to be part of this. 6 months later, we had that happen a number of times, where 6 months later somebody saw how things were evolving and developing, and then decided they wanted to be part of it. So sometimes stepping away, giving people the space to make up their own mind can be a helpful thing.
I think the big word that came out for me was allowed. What allows us to negotiate? And the second thing that was important I wanted to add about the Berlin Wall is how impressed I was with how leaders, at that time Khrushchev and Kennedy, how leaders can actually stop a war, and how absolutely incredible that was to me, and that happens, and many times it doesn't happen. So I think allowed is a big word.
Thank you.
Let's hear from the group that was Basima, Janan, and Osama.
I just heard it by other groups. Actually, one of the interesting things for me in negotiation, when I see both parties are stuck, the stuckness, point. That's for me the point I challenge myself and others, because I've seen it in many contexts, cultural contexts, areas in the world. And the last one, when I was the interpreter, actually, not the mediator, because both mediators were stuck with a Syrian refugee with his white Dutch neighbor, and they were fighting. They wanted to kill each other, actually. So my role from interpreter became the negotiator and the mediator, simply because I understood both contexts, the Arabic Syrian context and the Dutch context. And at the end, I was actually the one who tried to bring them together, and I did manage, actually, simply by looking at their faces and asking them the questions the mediators didn't even thought about, because they were stuck also. So I was sitting there and I've seen 4 people stuck. And that was for me the most, impressive, learning moment, to see how to get out from that stuckness. So for me, it's not only the place, because we were sitting in the house of the Syrian refugee, but also the context, the timing, everything around it.
What was one of the questions you used to unstick everybody there?
I asked the Syrian refugee, because I've seen almost he was wanted to cry, actually. He was a man. So I was holding his child on my lap. And I said, what exactly do you want? And can you tell me? Say it, in your own language. He said, nobody asked me this question. Nobody asked me in the Netherlands, how do I feel? And what do I want, And, that was, that's the most important, actually, question the mediator missed. And when I asked the same question to his neighbor, that came, actually, that was the most important, actually, part of the whole process that took more than 6 hours. So everybody was tired at the end. But at the end, I said, we have to move from this stuckness, And when I asked him, and I said, can you look at her face, just see how she feel about what's happening here. And when they looked, to each other's face, that was it. That was they melted, in a sense. The conflict was away, and they understood that both they have, their own needs and interests, because he was living above her and his child was running in the room and she had problem with the noise. It's a very simple thing, you might think, but it has escalated for more than 2 years. And that's why they invited me with those 2 certified mediators. And at the end, actually, we managed, all of us, to go out with a peaceful solution for all.
Congratulations. Marvelous.
Thank you.
We have a group that consisted of Carol and Rodrigo.
I work in a court, so I don't mediate anywhere that's very interesting, except in a courthouse meeting room. But I did talk about a mediation that I did many years ago with a couple of kids and their parents, and the children were in court for a misdemeanor altercation on a school bus. And after the mediation, the moms were outside exchanging phone numbers. So it was a great opportunity to bring some parents together and have their kids resolve an issue between them, and see that the families could get along and hopefully create a friendship.
What I would like to add is that talking about an interesting place where I have already negotiated, most of the times I was in a meeting room, so it's not much interesting place. But nowadays we are negotiating the Zoom or the cell phone. So anywhere you are, you can be negotiating, walking, cycling, or driving. But I think the Abraham Path is a particular special place where you can walk and talk and walk, and both together, side by side, facing the problem in front of you, not one people in front of the other, but both together, walking and facing the problem in front of you. That's something that I've heard about from William Ury, and I'd like to share with you, and I think that would be very interesting to walk the path, facing the problem together.
Well, we welcome you, Rodrigo. We're hoping that by the end of this year, or certainly by next spring, we can be inviting people to come and walk again, because it'll be safe. Abir and James Patrick Finnerty.
I can speak.
Great. Hi, nice to see you.
I think one of the most interesting parts of our conversation in our group, which was mostly introductory, introducing each other, there were two aspects of it. One, that what kept coming up for me was place, and that and remembering a place in the middle of nowhere in Brazil, a little village, a little residence nearby, but being able to, as Rodrigo was saying, go for walks, go for walks, go for walks in a peaceful, natural environment. And that has always been the most productive. And it's like when you're in a situation of removing boundaries. I'm not a negotiator. I seem to have that in common with my group. And but as people have said here, we are all negotiating all of the time. Or I'm not even sure. I think I come back to the idea in getting to yes often. I phrase it as, what are we talking about here? Which is getting behind yourself and anybody you're with and saying, like, what is the actual issue? Not the one we're discussing, but what is the issue that's behind this? That is what really needs to be addressed. And that's kind of a magic moment when that happens. And you suddenly, all these years, I thought it was this, but it's that.
Thank you for that report back. We want to hear about the Master Seminar on Negotiation wrapped in the Abraham Path.
This course is going to be done over 4 weeks, and it's going to have a mixture of what would be called synchronous and asynchronous aspects to it. So each week you're going to have some readings, some videos, and other some role play simulations, things along those lines to do. You'll largely have the week to do that, to do that work, if you will, on your own time. So it's kind of thing where you can do, your readings when you'd like. We're going to have you post into some discussion threads so that you can engage not just with me and others, but also the other people in the course. And then we're going to have a synchronous session each week of about 90 minutes where we'll all come together around hopefully an agreed upon time that works for everybody to talk through some of these things as well. In the first module, we're really going to be talking about how did the Abraham Path get started and what was the role of negotiation in there? And we'll probably take some of what we talked about today and go much deeper into all of that. We've got some case studies that were written for Harvard Business School that you'll be reading. And then we're going to talk more about this whole idea of the power of place and about walking and the dimensions of walking that are really important because they form the ethos of the Abraham Path. We'll talk also about the role of story. We usually use story in our negotiations, but how do you do that strategically? And how do you use it in many different ways to help to not only engage others, but perhaps when you're meeting with resistance or trying to change a conversation, how do you use stories to do that? In the second week, we're going to talk about, kind of push back on some commonly held misconceptions about negotiation. Often a lot of focus on compromise. It's really much more about creativity and looking for value and understanding what really matters to people. And so we're going to help you to think much more creatively and much differently and share a number of different examples, actually some of them from my book about creative solutions to difficult negotiation problems. In the third module, we'll talk about emotions, culture, and identity. And so we're going to talk about how do you handle the emotional side of negotiation. Emotions play a role, they always will. And if you try to push them aside, they tend to make their way back in, usually not in the most helpful of ways. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll absolutely zero in more and more on the different cultures that live along the path and what are some of the different ways in which people negotiate there. as well as getting into, sort of the personal side of negotiation, things that affect our identity. And I think that if anybody's worked in that area of the world, you know that identity is wrapped into all of this in a very important way, and it makes its way into negotiations. And so you've got to be able to think about that. And then finally, we'll sort of bring it all together by talking about understanding process and preparation. How do you prepare for your negotiations? And one of the former executive directors of the Abraham Path has written a simulation. And so you're going to have an opportunity to play that out in the last week of the program as a way of bringing everything together and rooting what we've talked about in negotiation to the path. So really, what we're doing here is we're trying to learn more and more about negotiation, wrapping it into the context of the Abraham Path in all its different facets.
I just want you to know that if you sign up to take this course as a result of this experience with Josh, we will give you $100 discount on the cost of the course, and the code you should use is webinar. Josh, do you want to pull things together from all that we've heard from our colleagues here?
Obviously, negotiation resonates very deeply with everybody here, and I think that the course is really an opportunity to build on that, to take that deeper, and to think a little bit about what's unique in the Abraham Path and how does that feed into negotiation in a way that can also help us to learn new and different aspects of negotiation. Moving away from some of the perhaps more typical things and thinking about, as Rodrigo mentioned, I've had the pleasure of doing a lot of walking side by side, and amazing ideas emerge. Creativity abounds when you do those kinds of things, and so there's just a lot of those lessons that I think can easily get woven into negotiation in a unique way.
We are going to leave you with a negotiation challenge. We would love for you to read this challenge, Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States, from his period, and put your answers, how you would solve this problem, into the URL that we include here, abrahampath.org/challenge. And a week from today, a week from our meeting, we will post how they did solve this challenge. And with that, I want to thank Josh Weiss for his great wisdom and leadership of this course and of the organization and the whole concept of the Abraham Path. And thanks to all of you for being with us. Feel free to be in touch. We're really looking to generate a community of people who not only walk on a path, but walk with that path within them. And I get a sense from all of you, from your report backs, that that's who we're talking to.